Commercial Vehicle Operators Safety Manual, Module 9, Hours of Service. Overview, Hours of Service, Learning Objectives, Hours of Service, Applications, Exemptions, Basic Requirements, Ontario Driving Limitations, Daily Limits, Daily Off-Duty Time, Work Shift Limits, Driving Cycles Limits, Logbooks, Required Information, Graph Grid, Logbook Exemption, Electronic Onboard Recording Device, Possession of Logs and Supporting Documents, Record Keeping, Operator Responsibilities, Proactive Measures, Reactive Measures, Self-Audit, Reviewing Hours of Service Logs, Corrective Action, Record Keeping, Enforcement and Penalties, Out-of-Service Declarations, Appendix A, Example of a Daily Logbook Record. Overview. The Commercial Safety and Compliance Branch of the Ministry of Transportation of Ontario has prepared this guide to assist and ensure that truck and bus companies, commercial vehicle operators, operate safely and are compliant with the regulations that govern highway use. Ontario, other provinces, the Government of Canada, and the transportation industry developed the rules and regulations to help reduce the number and severity of collisions. Each jurisdiction has used the National Safety Code standards as guides in drafting their own transportation safety legislation. This approach promotes uniformity across Canada and helps to ensure that the transportation industry remains as viable and sustainable as possible. This guide applies to Ontario operators of commercial motor vehicles that are trucks, tractors, mobile equipment vehicles, or trailers and/or any combination of these vehicles that have a registered gross weight or actual weight of more than 4,500 kilograms. Tow trucks, regardless of registered gross weight or actual weight. Buses with a manufactured seating capacity of 10 persons or more, excluding the driver. Accessible vehicles and school purposes vehicles, depending upon use. The guide contains several modules, each dealing with a specific topic. To get a complete picture of compliance requirements, you should obtain the complete guide. If you intend to use certain parts of this guide only, for example, Module 1, Getting Started, it is recommended that you also obtain the modules Introduction and Commercial Vehicle Operators Registration. This is a guide only and is not meant to be a substitute for relevant statutes and regulations. This guide highlights some important legal provisions, but is not an exhaustive description of all the laws that apply. Hours of service learning objectives. As you work through this module, you will be able to describe the Ontario regulatory requirements related to reducing driver fatigue and when each applies, identifying driver limitations, identifying the provisions for required rest and deferred rest time, understand cycle rules, understand the exemptions, identify the required information for logbooks and record keeping requirements for local drivers, describe and follow procedures for completing logbooks, describe the requirements for electronic onboard recording devices, identify the operator's responsibilities, including both proactive and reactive measures, understand enforcement and penalties for operators and drivers. Hours of service. Hours of service governs the maximum driving times and minimum off-duty times of commercial vehicle drivers, both bus and truck. Records of the daily driving and other work activities are required to be completed in a prescribed format and kept and made available to enforcement officials upon request. Applications. In Ontario, hours of service applies to operators who hold or should hold a CVOR certificate, trucks, tractors, or trailers, or a combination of these vehicles which have a registered gross weight or actual weight greater than 4,500 kilograms, or commercial passenger vehicles, buses, and vans with a designed seating capacity of 10 or more passengers, drivers of the above commercial vehicles. The Commercial Vehicle Hours of Service Regulations Application Guide is available and can be viewed or downloaded from the CCMTA's website. Exemptions. The Ontario Hours of Service requirements do not apply to the following vehicles. Tow trucks. Although tow trucks require a CVOR certificate, hours of service requirements do not apply at this time. A 2 or 3 axle vehicle being used for the transportation of primary products of a farm, forest, sea, or lake, where the driver or the motor carrier is the producer of those primary products, or a return trip after transporting the primary products of a farm, forest, sea, or lake, if the vehicle is empty or is transporting products used in the principal operation of a farm, forest, sea, or lake. A vehicle being used by a person in the lawful performance of his or her duties as an inspector. A cardiac arrest emergency vehicle operated by or under the authority of a hospital. A vehicle engaged in providing relief in an emergency, a situation or impending situation that constitutes a danger of major proportions to life, property, or the environment, whether caused by forces of nature, an accident, an intentional act, or otherwise. A vehicle operated by or on behalf of a municipality, road authority, or public utility while responding to a situation or impending situation that constitutes an imminent danger, though not one of major proportions to life, property, or the environment, whether caused by forces of nature, an accident, an intentional act, or otherwise. A bus that is operated by or on behalf of a municipality as part of its public transit service, either within the municipality or within 25 kilometers of the boundary of the municipality. A pickup truck, when driven for personal use, if the vehicle has a manufacturer's gross vehicle weight rating of 6,500 kilograms or less and is fitted with either the original box that was installed by the manufacturer, which has not been modified, a replacement box that duplicates the one that was installed by the manufacturer, which has not been modified. A large crane or a vehicle used in support of a large crane, while the vehicle is operated by a large crane operator and is carrying parts for the large crane. A large crane means a crane that is capable of raising, lowering, or moving any material that weighs more than 13,607 kilograms. Large crane operator, a person who holds a hoisting engineer mobile crane operator 1 certificate of qualification issued under the Ontario College of Trades and Apprenticeship Act 2009, or an apprentice in the trade of hoisting engineer, mobile crane operator 1. To claim the exemption, the driver must surrender a valid certificate of qualification or proof of apprenticeship to an officer for inspection. Basic requirements. Hours of service regulations in Ontario have 1. Daily driving requirements. 2. Mandatory off duty time and work shift requirements. 3. Work cycle requirements. 4. Record keeping requirements. Ontario driving limitations. For the 24-hour period day, a driver cannot drive more than 13 hours. During the 24-hour period day, a driver cannot drive after having been on duty more than 14 hours. During the 24-hour period day, a driver must be off duty for 10 hours, which must include 2 hours that are not part of a mandatory off duty period and are at least 30 minutes long. Daily limits. A day is defined as a 24-hour period that typically begins at midnight or another hour designated by the operator for the driver and shall apply for the duration of the driver's cycle. The 13-hour driving time in a day limit. No operator shall permit a driver to drive, and no driver shall drive a commercial vehicle after the driver has accumulated 13 hours of driving time in a day. The 14-hour on duty in a day limit. No operator shall permit a driver to drive, and no driver shall drive a commercial vehicle after that driver has accumulated 14 hours of on duty time in a day. The 14 hours of on duty time may consist of driving time plus on duty time when not driving. On duty, not driving time can mean, for example, working in the operator's office or facility, or loading or unloading the vehicle, inspecting the vehicle, waiting at the border, and so on. The 10 hours off duty in a day rule. An operator shall ensure that a driver takes at least 10 hours of off duty time in a day. This off duty time must include at least 2 hours of off duty time taken in blocks of not less than 30 minutes each. Off duty time means time when a driver is not working or driving. For example, taking a meal break. These periods can be added to, but not form, part of a period of 8 consecutive hours of off duty time as required by Section 9 of the regulation. The 8 consecutive hour requirement will be described in more detail in work shift limits. Note, the operator and driver are exempt from the requirement to take 10 hours off duty in a day while the driver is operating a mobile crane or concrete pumper. Daily off duty time. Step 1. Daily off duty time must total at least 10 hours, made up of periods of at least 30 minutes. For example, 2 hours off duty plus 1 hour of duty plus 7 hours off duty equals the required 10 hours off duty. Step 2. Daily off duty time must include 2 hours that do not form part of an 8-hour consecutive off duty period required by Section 9. They can be added to the period. Each day must include 2 hours of off duty time, 30 minutes, which is not greater than 30 minutes, which is not part of a mandatory 8 consecutive hour off duty period required by Section 9. In the above example, the driver would be in violation of the 10-hour off duty rule, despite being off duty for 10 hours, because all of the off duty hours form part of the mandatory 8 hours. Therefore, the driver did not take the additional 2 hours. Deferred time provision. If a driver is unable to take 10 hours off duty time in a day, then up to 2 hours of off duty time can be deferred to the following day. This deferral option can be exercised every second day if the driver chooses. In order to defer daily off duty time, a driver must meet the following conditions. The deferred off duty time does not form part of the mandatory period of 8 consecutive hours. Before the end of the second day, the driver takes a consecutive period of off duty time consisting of the consecutive 8 hours plus the off duty time deferred from the first day. For example, if 1 hour of off duty time is deferred from today, the driver must complete an off duty period of at least 9 consecutive hours by the end of tomorrow. The total off duty time in the 2 days must be at least 20 hours. The total driving time in the 2 days must not exceed 26 hours. The total on duty time in the 2 days does not exceed 28 hours. The driver may not use this deferral option when splitting the 8 consecutive hours in a sleeper berth in accordance with the sleeper berth split provision. The driver must declare in the remarks section of the daily log, clearly indicating the day from which the off duty time has been deferred and the day to which it was deferred. Work shift limits, mandatory off duty time, also known as work shift limits. A work shift is the period that begins when a driver goes on duty at the end of a period of at least 8 hours mandatory off duty time and ends when the driver starts the next period of at least 8 consecutive hours off duty. The 13-hour driving time in a work shift rule. After a driver has accumulated 13 hours of driving time from the end of the most recent period of 8 or more consecutive hours of off duty time, the operator shall not permit and the driver shall not drive again unless he or she takes at least 8 consecutive hours of off duty time. The 14-hour on duty in a work shift rule. After a driver has accumulated 14 hours of on duty time from the end of the most recent period of 8 or more consecutive hours of off duty time, the operator shall not permit and the driver shall not drive again unless he or she takes at least 8 consecutive hours of off duty time. The 16-hour elapsed time in a work shift rule. After 16 hours, all time has elapsed from the end of the most recent period of 8 or more consecutive hours of off duty time. The operator shall not permit and the driver shall not drive a commercial motor vehicle again unless he or she takes at least 8 consecutive hours of off duty time. 8 consecutive hours of required rest. The 8 or more consecutive hours of off duty required to restart a work shift may be a combination of off duty and sleeper berth time. A driver may also take the required 8 consecutive hours of rest in the sleeper berth, or split the sleeper berth time into 2 periods. The sleeper berth option is covered in detail in the next section. Sleeper berths. A driver can use a sleeper berth to split the required consecutive off duty hours into 2 periods while still complying with the daily off duty requirements. The sleeper berth must meet all construction and environmental standards specified in Section 8 of Ontario Regulation 555/06. Single drivers. If the vehicle has a sleeper berth that meets the definition in the regulation, the driver can split the mandatory off duty time into 2 sleeper berth periods if neither period is less than 2 hours, the total of the 2 sleeper periods is at least 10 hours, the off duty time is spent resting in the sleeper berth, the total off duty time in the day is at least 10 hours, the total driving time before and after each sleeper berth period does not exceed 13 hours. None of the daily off duty time is deferred to the next day. The elapsed time before and after each sleeper period does not include any driving time after the 16th hour when the driver comes on duty. The total of the on duty time before and after each sleeper period does not include any driving time after the 14th hour. Team drivers. If a vehicle has a sleeper berth that meets the definition in the regulation, team drivers can split the 8 hours of required off duty time into two sleeper berth periods if neither period is less than 4 hours, the total of the two sleeper periods is at least 8 hours, the off duty time is spent resting in the sleeper berth, the total driving time before and after each sleeper period does not exceed 13 hours. The elapsed time before and after each sleeper period does not include any driving time after the 16th hour when the driver comes on duty. None of the daily off duty time is deferred to the next day. The total of the on duty time before and after each sleeper period does not include any driving time after the 14th hour. Note, because the eligible sleeper berth periods require only a total of 8 hours, team drivers must take an additional 2 hours of off duty time to meet the daily 10-hour requirement. This time may or may not be spent in the sleeper berth. Driving cycles limits. Because of the cumulative effect of being on duty over several days and weeks, the hours of service regulations include a maximum on duty time for 7 and 14-day cycles. The operator will designate either a 7-day or 14-day cycle for drivers and shall require that each driver follow it. 7-day cycle. No operator shall permit and no driver on a 7-day cycle shall drive a commercial motor vehicle after having been on duty for 70 hours in that cycle. 14-day cycle. No operator shall permit and no driver shall drive a commercial motor vehicle on a 14-day cycle after having been on duty for 120 hours in that cycle. A driver who is following the 14-day cycle shall not drive again in that cycle after accumulating 70 hours of on duty time without having taken at least 24 consecutive hours of off duty time. Cycle reset. When a driver on a 7-day cycle takes 36 consecutive hours off duty, that cycle ends and a new one starts. When a driver on a 14-day cycle takes 72 consecutive hours off duty, that cycle ends and a new one starts. Once a driver can start a new cycle, they may switch their cycle or switch the starting time of their day. Cycle switching. Once a cycle has been designated, the driver may not switch to the other cycle unless the appropriate reset provision has been satisfied. Cycle switching and resets. If a driver wants to switch cycles or to reset their current cycle of accumulated hours back to zero, they must take the following number of hours off duty. To reset a 7-day cycle or switch from a 7-day cycle to a 14-day cycle, take at least 36 consecutive hours off. To reset a 14-day cycle or switch from 14-day cycle to a 7-day cycle, take at least 72 consecutive hours off. Note, a driver is only in violation when driving in excess of the cycle of cumulative hours permitted. Mandatory 24 hours off duty. Despite the cycle the driver is following, No operator shall permit, and a driver must not drive unless there has been at least 24 consecutive hours off duty in the preceding 14 days. Adverse driving conditions. Adverse driving conditions mean significantly impaired driving conditions that were not known or could not reasonably have been known to a driver or an operator dispatching a driver immediately before the driver began driving. A driver who encounters adverse driving conditions while operating a commercial motor vehicle may increase the daily driving time beyond 13 hours by up to 2 hours and the daily 14 hours of on duty time by up to 2 hours and reduce the required 10 hours of off duty time in a day by a corresponding amount. Increase the driving time beyond 13 hours in a work shift and sleeper berth splits by up to 2 hours and the 14 hours of on duty time in a work shift by up to 2 hours. However, the 16-hour elapsed time cannot be exceeded due to adverse driving conditions. If, as a result of this extension, the driver exceeds the on duty time for the cycle permitted under the 7 or 14-day cycles, the cycle requirements under those sections must be met by the end of the following day. If a driver extends his or her driving or on duty time due to adverse conditions, the reason for the extension must be entered in the remarks section of the daily log or on the time record required by an operator for a driver who is not required to complete a daily log. Logbooks. Required information. Operators are required to make sure that drivers maintain true and accurate daily logs. This is best done by having a monitoring system ensuring that drivers complete logbooks as required by legislation and are not falsifying them. A sample of a log that meets the requirements of the regulations is contained in the appendix at the end of this module. The daily log must contain the following required information. A driver shall, at the start of each day, enter the following information in the daily log. 1. The driver's name. 2. The date. 3. The name of the driver's co-drivers, if any. 4. The start time of the day being recorded, if the day does not start at midnight. 5. The cycle that the driver is following. 6. The odometer reading at the start of the day of the commercial motor vehicle to be operated by the driver. 7. Recorded in the remarks section of the log, the number of hours of on-duty and off-duty time as defined in this regulation that the driver accumulated each day during the 14 days immediately before the start of the day, for which the driver was exempt by this regulation from keeping a daily log. 8. The number plate of each commercial motor vehicle to be driven and each trailer to be drawn by the driver on that day. 9. The name of the operator for whom the driver is to drive during the day. 10. The addresses of the driver's home terminal and principal place of business of the operator for whom the driver is to drive during the day. A driver shall, over the course of each day, enter the following information in the daily log. 1. The start and end times for each duty status during the day. 2. Each city, town, village, or highway location and the province or state where the driver's duty status changes. A driver shall, at the end of each day, enter the following information in the daily log. 1. Total time spent in each duty status during the day. 2. The odometer reading at the end of the day. 3. The total distance driven by the driver. 4. The driver's signature certifying that the information provided is true and accurate. Graph grid. The graph grid has to be completed in the prescribed manner. A continuous line is drawn between the appropriate markers for each 24-hour period in the grid to record the period of time when the driver is off duty, in the sleeper berth, driving, on duty, not driving. Record the name of the municipality or location on a highway or legal subdivision, and the name of the province or state where each change of duty occurs. The graph grid is to be updated at the end of each change in duty status. If the driver is engaged in making deliveries in a municipality, which results in a number of periods of driving time being interrupted by short periods of other on duty time of less than 1 hour, the periods of driving time may be combined and the periods of other on duty time may be combined. At the end of each day, the total number of hours in each duty status shall be entered in the space to the right of each graph grid below the phrase total hours and shall add up to 24 hours. Note: drivers must prepare and maintain logs in the time zone of the driver's home terminal. Every motor vehicle is required to have a working odometer. A hub meter reading is acceptable in lieu of an odometer reading. Logbook exemption. Under the Ontario regulation, a driver is not required to keep a daily log for the day if, on the operator's instructions, a commercial motor vehicle is driven solely within a radius of 160 kilometers of the driver's starting location. The driver returns at the end of the day to the location from which he or she started. If a driver is not required to keep a daily log, the operator shall keep a record for the day showing the date, the driver's name, and the location at which the driver starts and ends the day, the cycle that the driver is following, the hour at which each duty status starts and ends, and the total number of hours spent in each duty status, the number of hours of on duty time and off duty time within the meaning of this regulation that the driver accumulated each day during the 14 days immediately before the start of the day for which the driver was exempt from this regulation and not required to keep a daily log. For the purpose of the hour at which each duty status started and ended, if the driver is on duty within a municipality such that a number of periods of driving time are interrupted by a number of periods of other on duty time of less than 1 hour each, the periods of driving time may be combined and the periods of other on duty time may be combined. The exemption from having to keep a logbook does not exempt a driver from being in compliance with the remainder of the hours of service regulations. It applies only to the requirement of maintaining a logbook. If any of the above conditions that exempt the driver from keeping a logbook end, then the driver must maintain a daily log for each day he or she does not qualify for the exemption. A driver must begin to prepare a daily log for the day immediately after becoming aware that the terms of the exemption cannot be met. The daily log must cover the entire day, even if the driver has to retroactively record changes in status that occurred between the time of reporting for duty and the time in which he or she no longer qualified for the 160-kilometer radius exemption. The driver is required to enter in the remarks section the number of hours of off duty and on duty time that accumulated each day during the previous 14 days, or on one daily log that clearly indicates all required information. A driver may carry the record of duty status for the previous 14 days instead of entering in current daily log the times they were on and off duty for the previous 14 days. Example of remarks section: vacation time off duty, city work on duty, city work on duty, city work on duty, off duty, off duty, city work on duty, off duty. Electronic onboard recording device. An electronic or mechanical recording device is allowed instead of the driver maintaining a manual log, as long as the device records time and movement of the vehicle. The device must automatically record the number of times that it is disconnected and keep a record of the time and date of these disconnections. The device must also keep track of and record the total on duty time remaining in the driver's cycle, as well as the total accumulated on duty time in the cycle. The device must be capable of storing all of this required information, as well as the information that must be included in a logbook. The device must be able to display the stored information in a readable format on demand. The driver must be ready to manually prepare log forms should the device not work. When requested by a peace officer, the driver must be prepared to complete manual logs using the information stored in the device for the period of the declared cycle. Operators may choose to maintain electronic data downloads of driver log information for a minimum period of 6 months, thereby meeting the record retention requirement. Possession of logs and supporting documents. A driver who is required to keep a daily log must have in his or her possession the daily log for the current day, completed up to the time at which the last change in the driver's duty status occurred. A copy of daily logs for the preceding 14 days. Note, drivers will be permitted to record multiple days off duty on one daily log. For example, one daily log indicates April 20th to 2009 to April 21st, 2009 off duty. If a driver was exempt from keeping a daily log for any of the preceding 14 days, there are 3 options available. Option 1, the driver must record in the remarks section of the current daily log the number of on-duty and off-duty hours for each day of the preceding 14 days for which the driver was not required to keep a daily log. Option 2, the driver may carry the time records required to be kept for any day for which a daily log is not available. Option 3, drivers can produce any combination of the current log with on-duty and off-duty hours recorded in the remarks section for any day that a daily log was not required in the previous 14 days, and the duty status records or daily logs. For example, if the driver's preceding 14 days included the following activities: current day, drive CMV log required; preceding day, drive CMV log required; preceding day 2, day off; preceding day 3, day off; preceding day 4, drive CMV local time records; preceding day 5, drive CMV local time records; preceding day 6, log required; preceding day 7, log required; preceding day 8, day off; preceding day 9, day off; preceding day 10, log required; preceding day 11, log required; preceding day 12 and 13, local time record; preceding day 14, day off. The driver would have the option of surrendering the following. Option 1, the current daily log and a daily log for each of the preceding 14 days. Option 2, any daily log required to be completed in the preceding 14 days. Current days 1, 6, 7, 10, 11, and recorded on the current log the number of on-duty and off-duty hours for days 2, 3, 4, 5, 8, 9, 12, 13, and 14. Option 3, any daily log required to be completed in the preceding 14 days, current days of 1, 6, 7, 10, 11, and recorded on the current log the number of on-duty and off-duty hours for days 2, 3, 8, 9, 14, and carry time records completed for days 4, 5, 12, and 13. When requested by an inspector, the driver must produce his or her logs and trip documentation without delay. Documentation includes anything in the driver's possession that an inspector may use to determine compliance. Record keeping. The driver is required to submit each completed original log to the operator within 20 days of being produced. The driver must also submit any supporting documents for that daily log as well. A driver who is employed by two or more operators is required to provide each operator with a copy of all logs. This lets each operator monitor the driver's hours of service for dispatch purposes. Operators are also required to keep a copy of driver's logs at their principal place of business for at least 6 months. If the operator has more than one terminal and the daily logs are turned into the driver's home terminal, then the operator must ensure that they are deposited at the principal place of business within 30 days of receiving them. Operator responsibilities. Section 28 of Ontario Regulation 555/06 requires operators to monitor the compliance of each driver to the regulations. An operator that determines that there has been non-compliance with the regulations shall take immediate remedial action and record the dates on which the non-compliance occurred, the date of issuance of a notice of non-compliance, and the action taken. Proactive measures. A proactive approach is a key component to the hours of service management program. Operators need to develop and implement written policies and procedures to ensure compliance with the regulations. While demonstrating due diligence, the operator has the ability to undertake corrective action through the application of its disciplinary process. Effective training of operational staff responsible for driver supervision and dispatch, in addition to driver training, is an integral component of a safety management program. Personnel must have knowledge and understanding of the regulations and be aware of the policies, procedures, and available options. To achieve a high level of compliance, you need effective training of new drivers and retraining of those who have demonstrated a continuing pattern of violations. This will also ensure minimal intervention from enforcement agencies. Operators must ensure that drivers are only dispatched when there are a sufficient number of on-duty hours available for use. Therefore, a system to monitor a driver's available on-duty time is essential. One example of hours of service tracking system is when a driver calls the company dispatcher on a daily basis with the accumulated hours for the previous day, and the dispatcher keeps a record of these hours. From the information provided by the driver, the dispatcher is able to calculate the driver's available hours remaining in the declared cycle. Reactive measures. The operator must have the necessary tools available to react when violations of regulations and associated company policies are identified. Tools that can help identify and modify inappropriate driver behavior include a self-audit program, timely reviews of driver records, driver disclosures, non-disclosures, and the carrier profile. Corrective measures may include retraining and/or disciplinary action as identified in the operator's disciplinary process. Failure to take corrective action means that the cycle of noncompliance will continue. Self-audit. A self-audit is an integral component of an operator's safety program. It provides the operator with the ability to readily identify areas of noncompliance. Audits involve the review of driver logbooks, support documentation such as fuel and lodging receipts, and any other relevant record or information. You need to document the findings to support any corrective disciplinary action taken. The sample size of the self-audit will vary according to the size of the company. A small operator may choose to audit all driver logs, but a large company may audit a portion of the drivers for a selected period of time. Driver logbooks should be audited to ensure that there is a log for every day. Logbooks are complete with all required information. Drivers are in compliance with the regulations, driving limits, required off duty time, and the cycle limits as applicable. Logs are accurate when compared to supporting documents such as dispatch records, fuel receipts, payroll, bills of lading. Logs are accurate when analyzed for distance traveled over a period of time. On-duty time logged by the driver agrees with the driver's statement of hours worked for payroll submission. Driving with a co-driver is substantiated and the hours declared by the two drivers are appropriate. For example, both drivers not log driving at the same time. The operator and the driver are complying with any permit conditions. Records are kept in chronological order for each driver and retained for at least 6 months. Radius exemption daily records are available, if appropriate, and all 4 exemption criteria are met every day. Reviewing hours of service logs. Under the hours of service legislation, there are many different ways of reviewing an hours of service log to determine if it is in compliance. A 3-step process is offered here. All 3 main steps must be in compliance. 1. Check the daily logs to ensure they are complete and accurate. 2. Check the day. 3. Check the work shift. 4. Check the cycles. Note, in addition, the reviewer must always check to evaluate if an exemption is being used by the driver. 1. Check the daily logs to ensure they are complete and accurate. Ensure that the daily log contains all required contents outlined in Regulation 555/06. The information recorded in the daily log is accurate, including but not limited to the date, driver name, assigned cycle, vehicle information, duty status, and/or locations. This step should include a comparison of supporting documents to logged driver duty status and location information. Failure to maintain a complete and accurate daily log is a violation. The required contents of a handwritten daily log are prescribed in sections 19 and 20 of Ontario Regulation 555/06, hours of service. Number 2, check the day. Start time of the 24-hour period must be specified by the operator. Regular time, including use of sleeper berth, no driving after 13 hours of driving. No driving after 14 hours on duty. At least 10 hours off duty. Note, the driver can drive at least 8 hours of this time, but must be consecutive, and there must be 2 additional hours off duty in no less than 30-minute periods that do not form part of the 8 consecutive hours. Deferred time. Option of deferring up to 2 hours of daily off-duty time to the second day. Total driving time in 2 days, not more than 26 hours. Total on-duty time in 2 days, not more than 28 hours. Total off-duty time in 2 days, not less than 20 hours. A mandatory off-duty period of at least 8 plus the number of hours deferred completed before the end of the second day. Note, this exemption cannot be used with split sleeper provision. 3. Check the work shift. Period between the end of one period of 8 hours or more off duty and the start of the next period of 8 hours or more off duty. No sleeper berth used. No driving after 13 hours of driving. No driving after 14 hours on duty. No driving after 16 hours of elapsed time. Note, elapsed time includes all time in a work shift. Single driver using sleeper berth. Driving time before and after each period in the eligible sleeper period not to exceed 13 hours. No driving after the on duty time before and after each eligible sleeper period exceeds 14 hours. The period, the driver may not drive after the elapsed time before and after each eligible sleeper period exceeds 16 hours. Note, each eligible sleeper period must not be less than 2 hours, and the total of the two periods must be at least 10 hours. Team drivers using sleeper berth. Driving time before and after each period in the eligible sleeper period not to exceed 13 hours. No driving after the on duty time before and after each eligible sleeper period exceeds 14 hours. The driver may not drive after the elapsed time before and after each sleeper period exceeds 16 hours. Note, each eligible sleeper period must not be less than 4 hours, and the total of the two periods must be at least 8 hours. Number 4, check the cycles. Cycle must be specified by the operator. 7-day cycle. Verify the driver did not drive after accumulating 70 hours of on duty time in any period of 7 consecutive days. Note, a driver may end a 7-day cycle and start a new cycle by taking 36 consecutive hours off duty. When a driver starts a new cycle, the accumulated hours are deemed to be 0, and the hours start to accumulate again in the new cycle. 14-day cycle. Verify the driver did not drive after accumulating 120 hours of on-duty time in any period of 14 consecutive days. Verify the driver did not drive after accumulating more than 70 hours at any time during the cycle without taking 24 hours off duty. Note, a driver may end a 14-day cycle and start a new cycle by taking 72 consecutive hours off duty. When a driver starts a new cycle, the accumulated hours are deemed to be 0, and the hours start to accumulate again in the new cycle. Day off. Verify that the driver did not drive at any time without having a period of 24 consecutive hours off duty in the preceding 14 days, regardless of the day or cycle being worked. Corrective action. Corrective action may take the form of reevaluation and assessment, retraining, or the application of the disciplinary process leading up to and including dismissal. Corrective actions should be part of an operator's safety plan. Employees must be aware of its existence in the safety plan. An operator may choose to have new employees acknowledge that they have been informed of the disciplinary policy at the time of hire, in addition to having a copy of the policy in plain view for all employees to see. The disciplinary process should be progressive in nature. For example, it could start with a documented verbal warning and then escalate to a written warning signed by the driver, and then suspensions, and ultimately termination. Operators should identify offenses that would result in immediate termination. Record keeping. The operator is required to maintain driver logbooks and support documents for a period of at least 6 months. If a driver is exempt from keeping logbooks, the operator is responsible for retaining the appropriate time records and supporting documents. These records must be kept at the operator's principal place of business in Ontario and in chronological order. The operator is required, upon request by an officer, to produce these records during normal business hours. An officer is not required to give the operator prior notice of inspections. Enforcement and penalties. Drivers and operators in violation of the hours of service regulations may be charged. Violations of these regulations by a driver or the operator that result in convictions are included in the operator's record. An accumulation of these convictions, solely or in combination with convictions for any other type of offense under the Highway Traffic Act, may result in the operator being identified for further monitoring and enforcement options. Out of service declarations. Drivers on the road who cannot produce the requested records are subject to being placed out of service. Drivers driving beyond the hours of service limitations are subject to prohibition of driving by an officer until such time that they have enough hours available to proceed. Drivers may be placed out of service for 10 consecutive hours for violation of the daily driving and on duty rules. If a driver fails to comply with the off duty time requirements, they may be placed out of service for the number of hours needed to correct the failure. Drivers may be placed out of service for 72 consecutive hours for any of the following violations. Driver is unable or refuses to produce his or her daily log. There is evidence that the driver completed more than one daily log for the day, entered inaccurate information, or falsified the daily log. Driver mutilates or defaces a daily log or supporting documents in such a way that it cannot be determined whether the driver has followed the driving time and off duty requirements. Appendix A, example of a daily logbook record.